different regions, from different areas across the country. So just wanting to be mindful of our relationship to the lands and the people who were here before us. And so as I'm the Indigenous Minister for Chinook-Winds region of the United Church of Canada here in Southern Alberta, and work quite extensively with the 91 churches that are under my purview, and then help to build and bridge issues of reconciliation. So for me, I just wanted to say thank you for allowing me to come and present and to be part of this session. I'm just lighting the smudge here, and we'll have our opening prayer. We gather the herbs in the mountains here in Alberta. These are part of our traditional way of offering prayer. This is our communion. This is our way of worship. And we do this as a cleansing and a purification to bring our minds into this place and to remember that we are all connected through the Creator to one another. So let us pray. Creator God, one who watches over us, one who guides us, one who brought us into this world with all our gifts, with all our blessings, to live a good and flourishing life. We know that things have not always been easy when we try to get along with one another, that we come across anger and hostility and violence. We also come across helpfulness and love. We cherish those moments. We give thanks for all those that have reached out to us as family, friends, loved ones, people of our community, who have helped to nurture us into this space. We give thanks for all of those that have gone on before us, that have helped to pave the way to where we are today. We pray for those that are weak and ailing, those that are sick, those that are weak in spirit, pray that you would be with them. Jesus Christ, Amen. We do this smudge and this communion at the beginning, as we are called to do by our elders. But we always begin the day with a smudge. We always begin our practice remembering the Creator is always with us. So for generations, we were not allowed to do that. So we are mindful that we take advantage of that opportunity to share the teaching and share our way of life as we enter into these different spaces where we can be of use and of help to others. In our land acknowledgements, I have a few versions that I've written for a national audience and for groups, but it continues to evolve in terms of my relationship through these words to others. And so here's the one that I have for today. As Indigenous people, we are connected to these lands by tradition and story. We are embedded in these lands by the souls of our ancestors who lived out their stories across the wide streams, open plains, and mountaintops. Their bodies lie in state as a testament to our belonging. Around the world, our Indigenous brethren call their mountains ancestors. They call their lakes holy. They are places of origin, places that hold our creation stories. They are places of ancestral burial, places of mystery, sacred spaces, imbued with spirits that our forebears knew. These places are where our ancestors made connections to the land that continue today. These are sacred places. Today, these lands are taken away, separated from, and made off limits to their original owners. Creation suffers for our lack of stewardship and protocol. Redress is needed. Healing is needed. By our efforts, we work toward a healed world tomorrow. So I give thanks to all of you for coming and taking part in this journey, and I will turn it back over to Lori. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. So our time together will be a chance to hear from the delegates about the conference itself and some highlights and reflections as people of faith as they engage in this important gathering. So let's begin with ask each of our delegates to introduce themselves, who you are, and very briefly how you came to be involved in climate work. So Janet, Tony, and then we'll go over to Carrie. Just briefly.
Thanks, Lori. Briefly, yes, I got that. I am Janet Gray. I live on Lekwungen-speaking people's lands outside of Victoria, British Columbia on the West Coast. I am a member of First Met United Church, and I am an activist. I am somebody who cares deeply and passionately about all things on this planet and for all of creation. I am a human rights activist. I come to it from many years of being involved in Kairos and the United Church on different levels. And I'm really grateful to be able to be, as I said to somebody earlier, a fly on the wall in some very important negotiations that are happening for all of us in this world, and to be able to try and find ways to connect them with others as I think about them and bring them back to everybody. So thank you.
Tony?
Hi, my name is Tony Snow. I'm the Indigenous Minister for the Chinookwiz region in Southern Alberta. I am on the Climate Advisory Circle and on the Anti-Racism Common Table for groups across Canada working on the anti-racist denomination process. I come here from the Stoney Nakoda First Nation. My father was the first Indigenous minister in Alberta for the United Church of Canada in 1963 when he was ordained. I grew up in the church, I grew up in my community, and live out that now in my later years because of the work that I've done with elders. So I worked a lot in industry, I worked a lot with elders and mitigation and traditional land use studies and traditional knowledge and stories. And so that's my background and my relationship to what is important for our people. Part of the journey in developing an understanding about what creation means to all of us.
Thanks, Tony. And let's hear from Carrie, who's joined us as well.
Good afternoon. Thank you. My name is Carrie Monben. I'm the Senior Policy Analyst at Citizens for Public Justice, a national organization of members inspired by faith to act for justice in Canadian public policy. I've had the privilege of working at CPJ for the last 13 years, first as the socioeconomic policy analyst, and for the last number of years on climate justice. I'm also a mother, a farmer, a wife, an artisan. And in terms of how I came to climate justice work, it was interesting to reflect on that question because I've been doing it for so long now, you kind of forget where things start. But my education is in international development. And when I went looking for a summer placement during my undergrad, I ended up working in Quito, Ecuador with an environmental organization who I think as many Indigenous organizations and folks in the Global South were so far ahead of my own thinking in terms of the interconnectedness of all of the social and ecological issues that we had been dealing with then, and that was in 1995, and that we continue to deal with now. But I moved to the climate justice file at CPJ in 2011 after my daughter was born, and realizing that this was a big piece that we needed to really grapple with in order for all of our work in all of the other areas to make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie and Tony. and Janet. And these are 3 members of our delegation. And it's for this year, we have an ecumenical delegation. There's 5 other delegates who are participating virtually in our conference. As you see, Janet and Tony are representing the United Church, and then Carrie is part of the broader For the Love of Creation delegation through her membership with CPJ, and also as advocacy chair of the For the Love of Creation. So I thought would be a nice next step would be to just share a bit about For the Love of Creation, which is an ecumenical effort the United Church is involved in and is really our focus right now in terms of engagement on climate justice. And then to hear as well, what is COP and what are some of the key issues? So I've asked Carrie to begin with that, and then Janet and Tony will add to that after. So thanks, Carrie, if you could tell us about that.
Yes. I always admire the people who share their screens so seamlessly, because for me, it always seems to take a little bit. So just very briefly, I'm really grateful for the depth and breadth of engagement of the United Church of Canada in For the Love of Creation. But for any of you for whom this might be new, For the Love of Creation is a national initiative that brings together faith bodies, so national churches and other faith-based organizations that both work domestically and in the international development realm from across Canada. And we've come together under a unified banner to mobilize education, reflection, action, and advocacy for climate justice. This, of course, builds on many, many, many years of collaboration across faith-based organizations in Canada, but we formalized that collaboration in April of 2020. And what I'm going to spend most of my time here talking about are some of the key advocacy pieces that we have developed at For the Love of Creation, and that we're sort of we worked around through a faith in action campaign that started in February this year and actually ended with the federal election when that was called in August. So it was meant to go to October, but started a little bit earlier. And what's interesting here is I'm going to share 3 advocacy goals that were developed in collaboration among member organizations or endorsing organizations of For the Love of Creation, but also with a very deliberate intent to make sure that we were aligned with the broader climate justice community. And a big part of that was really just a recognition that when we come together and can speak of one voice, we have a better opportunity, a higher likelihood of actually influencing the outcomes and impacting Canadian public policy. So the first call was for the Government of Canada to increase our national greenhouse gas emissions reductions target. We wanted them to commit to reducing emissions by 60% below 2005 levels by 2030. And at the same time to invest in a just transition to an inclusive, a fair, inclusive, and green economy. The second one was to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, including but not limited to the right of free, prior, and informed consent. And finally, to commit equal support for climate change adaptation and mitigation measures in the Global South. And this was related to increasing Canada's climate finance pledge and following through on commitments that were made in previous years. And also, though, recognizing that because emissions have continued to rise and the impacts of climate change have continued to be felt, we need not only to be investing in or contributing to mitigation measures, but also assisting those in the Global South to adapt to the changing realities. One of the things that was really interesting to see this year was that there was actually progress made across all 3 of these issues. And yet, I'm going to kind of skip ahead and then circle back to that a little bit. We're still at a point where we haven't done nearly enough, and we need our government to step up and really take more meaningful action going forward. So if I start with our call for increased ambition and investment in a just transition, even as we were getting ready to launch this campaign, Canada released a new climate plan And the federal government also introduced climate accountability legislation, which started off fairly weak, but through some good parliamentary process and civil society engagement was strengthened and became law in June of this year. In April of this year, also related to this ask, the Prime Minister announced that Canada will enhance our emissions reductions target under the Paris Agreement to reducing emissions by 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030. And this was the first time we'd seen a shift since before the Liberals took power in 2015. So it was a good step, but again, it fell short of what we were calling for, which was also informed by Canada's historic emissions and ongoing contributions to climate change, to the contribution of the problem, I mean. We also had asked the government to invest in a just transition. There had been some promises, but progress here has been much slower. There is now an ongoing federal consultation on a people-centered just transition, and interesting to see that that is held at Natural Resources, which is now where Minister Wilkinson, who was our Minister of the Environment, Climate Change, is located. And we actually have, for the first time ever, somebody who built his career in environmental activism as our Minister of the Environment, Climate Change. The second call to action was for the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, including but not limited to the right of free, prior, and informed consent. This is important here because we believe that climate action cannot be separated from the broader process of Indigenous self-determination and decolonization. And that is also because the climate crisis has stemmed from colonial ways of thinking and operating. So that also needs to be addressed in a holistic way. And we need to see systemic change to truly respect and honor Indigenous sovereignty. So we, and I recognize that this was not universally felt, but there was general celebration with the passage of Bill C-15, which now requires the government of Canada to put together an action plan on the implementation of the UN Declaration in Canada. And finally, we asked for the government to scale up our support for climate change measures in the Global South to at least $4 billion per year. And also in June, it was quite busy and rather productive in June. At the G7 summit, the Prime Minister announced a doubling of Canada's climate finance to 5.3 billion Canadian dollars over 5 years. So again, here it was another important step, but in all three of these areas, we sit in a really difficult tension right now where there is movement forward and yet not nearly enough being done. And I'll wrap this up really briefly because I've lost track of my time and I may be behind. A few takeaways here. Canada's made some important progress this year. In order to truly respond to the climate emergency, we need to see much more action. We can all be part of these climate solutions, and faith-based advocacy, which is something I didn't speak to specifically, but is important to name, is very critical, and we have seen that it works. Thank you. Oh, am I supposed to keep going on what is COP?
Sure, thanks.
All right. I didn't prepare a slide for this part, but I'll try to be brief because I think I talked a little too much. So what we use, we often use the shorthand for this when we talk about COP, and this is the 26th COP, which is the Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And one of the key reference points in this is actually COP21, which took place in 2015 in Paris, where the Paris Agreement on Climate Change was formed. And it is the Paris Agreement that forms the basis of international collaboration and cooperation towards addressing the climate emergency. This year, there were 4 goals that were identified by the presidency of the COP, which is the UK government. 1, to secure global net zero by mid-century and keep 1.5 degrees within reach. So within the Paris Agreement, there was a striving to limit warming to 1.5 degrees over pre-industrial levels, and a recognition that commitments that have been made to date will not allow this to happen. And certainly Canada's emissions reductions target is not at all aligned with 1.5 degrees of warming. The second goal of COP26 is to adapt to protect communities and natural habitats. So this is a little bit of what I mentioned earlier in terms of recognizing that we are feeling the impacts of climate change and needing to support community and habitat adaptation. To mobilize finance, because despite some movements in climate finance, we're still falling far short of what is needed to support countries in the global south. And this situation has actually been aggravated through the pandemic and with tremendous challenges related to vaccine inequity as well. And finally, to work together to deliver, which is kind of vague language, but it's really about finalizing the rules in what's called the Paris Rulebook. So really the operationalization of the Paris Agreement, and also exploring other collaborations. So civil society, private sector, and others. So fundamentally, what we're looking at these 2 weeks is to see if we can have action aligned with the scientific imperative of reducing emissions.
You too.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie. So we have this Coles Note version of the COP conference, and there are thousands of people in Glasgow and many who plan to come, but because of the vaccine issue and other disparities, we're not able to access. And then sometimes once they're there, it's hard, but that may be something our delegates may speak to. So let me not steal their thunder and hear from Janet. Would you like to share a bit about your highlights, any concerns? Like this event started on Sunday. We're now Thursday. So there's been several days of world leaders gathering and then now into negotiations. So Janet, over to you to share a bit about your highlights or concerns in the past few days.
Thanks, Laurie. I just want to highlight how grateful I am to have somebody like Carrie in our group, because she comes with a background already in paying attention to this kind of negotiation and these kind of statements, and has for many years. And so CPJ has been doing some great analysis for a long time on these issues. I come as a complete lay person, as I mentioned, activist. I come from a health background. I come from, so paying attention to the things going on has been challenging in that I'm trying to pay attention to the key asks for love of creation that were mentioned earlier. And I hear all of those things being mentioned in both the official rooms inside and in some of the sort of side activities. There's sort of official plenaries and workshops. And then there's all these side things going on, both inside and outside. And so that and all around the world, there's side things going on. So there's a lot of interesting discussions going on right now. And if any of you are interested, I really recommend that you go to some of the websites that maybe could be listed in some way for you in the chat. But it's fascinating, and there's a lot of analysis starting to come out now after a few days about what actually has been said. And I think it's great that one thing personally as a highlight, I mean, there's no discussion now amongst, well, first of all, apparently for years, the finance people have never been at COPs. Or rarely, or only in a few number. Now, every bank and financial institution in the world is paying attention to what's going on right now. Insurance institutions are paying attention and present. So that is significant. It's good. As somebody desperate for everything to change, I guess it's good that they're all going, well, there's a problem here. That's good, right? And they also are not even, nobody's negotiating whether it's 2 degrees or 1.5, it's 1.5. Now, there's also lots of conversations on the side about how this really, and they keep mentioning net zero, but net zero is an interesting target because that means that we're trying to fix something that's been damaged, just bring it down to just sort of level playing ground, but it's not talking about all the harm that we have to fix to really thrive. So there have been a few mentions of the word thriving and doing more, like sort of a net positive kind of thing. But in all of the money that's being offered, there's a lot of questions that are raised in my mind and amongst our group and amongst many about how that translates to human rights, how that relates to Indigenous rights, how that relates to how the money gets dispersed. And so that's both here at home in Canada and abroad. And so I don't know if I need to say much more at this point, but it's been fascinating and there's quite a few more days to go. And yeah, I'm interested to hear what Tony has to say.
I guess that's my cue. Thank you. I went to the Madrid conference in 2019, just before the pandemic hit, and took part in a lot of the activity in the 500,000 march that went through Madrid, and took part in the events every day for the 2 weeks of COP. And a lot of the things that I was seeing in terms of our involvement, our ability to engage and raise issues, very limited, but still I think there were tremendous opportunities there that we can, as a faith organization, as an organization raising from civil society, to be involved. And so this year, when we started talking about this, I was very interested in what sort of advocacy could happen here at home. Because as I was there in 2019, looking at what was going on, it would have been nice to have more involvement and more response coming out of Canada, and in terms of letter writing campaigns or things that we could do to act versus merely attending, getting information, being overrun with that information, and then seeing the futility of some of the decisions that were made that came out of that COP25 in 2019. Here, several years later, I think it's things have changed. We have a condition of our humanity with the COVID virus all over the world. We're starting to see greater and greater climate impacts and things that are happening on the ground. And we have much more advocacy coming from youth, coming from different populations, coming from Indigenous groups. And so all of these help in terms of raising the issue and making that more prevalent. Also things like Black Lives Matter and Idle No More and raising awareness of missing and murdered Indigenous women. All of these raise the profile of situations that are untenable for our communities. And so as we move forward, looking through the solutions of this one issue, which is connected to all issues, is connected to everything. And so the status quo of incrementalism, of moving forward in small steps, is challenged by the efforts of those outside of that building, outside of COP and outside of those halls of those that are making the decisions, to be influenced by what's going on in the world around us. And we hear that in the voices of leaders and things that they have said, not necessarily in the actions they have taken. And so the accountability there as citizens, as voters, as people who are involved in these arguments need to step into those spaces, from Indigenous protests at COP. There were a few in 2019, and with the effects of COVID, it's really hindered that profile. Every morning we would have the youth in the ACT Alliance and others from the faith community preparing and delivering different actions every day. And so we don't see that. We don't have as much of a profile around that. Those things were hitting CNN and all of the other networks as they were happening. And Greta Thunberg walking in was like sort of a rock star moment. But in the overall effect, today it's very quiet. It's very limited in how much Indigenous and other activists are being heard. And so I think it really comes down to who's listening and who is able to help in raising those voices, lifting up those voices. Another thing that we're looking at is there's a lot of good words around Indigenous involvement. At the table, people talking and actually working through some framework and logistical stuff with different Indigenous groups and highlighting that in their responses at the meetings, at the different general meetings. But those voices are only there to advise, they're only there to help in the background. They're not at the table, they're not helping and deciding. They're giving over their information, and then that is being considered. This is what happens in industry all the time. Having worked in industry and seeing some of the tribunals and other effects of the different regulatory bodies, that there isn't a lot of interaction or engagement with Indigenous people. There's a lot of writing of reports that will give an overview and a suggestion and maybe a recommendation, but not a lot of real grassroots movements in terms of mitigation and how we will work together through these solutions. So it's been interesting to see at COP some of the Indigenous groups putting forward solutions, putting forward programs of what they're doing in their communities and how they're utilizing their space and knowledge and resources to develop. And so that's been interesting. The concern there is that we are realistic about that and what the parameters of those individual projects are and how that's being interpreted through this lens of climate issue and greenwashing that the larger international community likes to take credit for. And so trying to have a balance of saying that one issue is not going to solve everything, but we need to continue to build on what we're doing in order to find a better way to work towards solutions. Because what's happening at COP is a lot of process, a lot of micromanaging of policy and agreements, and that the Indigenous people are sort of left out of the equation at the end of the day. And so we do have finance and being at the table, that's an incredible move forward, but they're bringing capitalistic solutions. They're bringing parameters that fit the models that these economies and governments are working with already. The Indigenous people don't have that perspective and don't have that involvement or framework in mind when they're working through some of these issues. So those are the kind of things that I'm thinking about as I'm taking part every day and trying to discern what is going to be of value coming out of this. And I think a lot of it for me is, where is this going in terms of our advocacy and our involvement? How does this turn to what a lot of our leaders are saying into action? And how does this make a concerted effort to bring us to another level that is not where we've been spinning around for the past couple of decades? And though there has been an increasing evolution of that, it's still too slow for what we need in terms of what's happening on the ground level for our environment. Thank you.
Carrie, do you want to jump in on your highlights or experience thus far?
Sure. I'm going to lead by saying we were asked for highlights or concerns. So I'm going to start with concerns and come back to highlights because and I'm going to share my screen again really briefly because despite being a policy analyst, what I found is that there's a meme that was created by some colleagues recently that actually synthesizes what I'm feeling really better than anything that I could say. I'll let this circulate a couple more times before I stop sharing my screen. But really, the concern I have is that our government is saying all of the right things. They've adopted a language that suggests and sounds like they really understand what the extent and the urgency of the problem is. And yet, when we look at really what is being done, we're falling far short. So one of the pieces that was named in that meme was that a couple of days ago, there was an announcement that Canada was going to cap emissions from the oil and gas sector. And when they said, I think that might have actually been on Monday, on the first day during the heads of government summit. And so there's something about it that's inherently exciting. It's like, okay, we're doing this. And I kept thinking, okay, I'll have to dig in. I'll have to go find, where's the information about what that cap is. And there isn't any. What they've said, they've announced that this is something that they're going to do. They're going to talk to the provinces. They're going to talk to business. They're going to talk to everybody, and they're going to decide. And the Net Zero Advisory Commission, which is important. And then so they haven't set a cap. They've decided that one day, hopefully sooner than later, they will set a cap. And the other reason for concern with this is that back in 2016, when the government was developing the Pan-Canadian Framework on clean growth and climate change, I think is what it was called. There too, there was part of the negotiation with the province of Alberta that then had an NDP premier was that they would cap emissions from the oil sands. But they set the cap at 100. I'm not going to remember the specific numbers, but it was the megatons that they were going to allow to before they would reach the cap were just so far beyond what was actually already being emitted and contrary to a measure that was intended to reduce emissions. So there's some concerns there. Today, there was a little flurry because there was an announcement Canada signed on to, an international announcement to end international public finance to the oil and gas sector. But it actually doesn't include public finance and subsidies that our government gives to the oil and gas sector within Canada. And I'm seeing some of the comments come up, and I get that there are some challenges that we need to overcome in terms of the concentration of the oil and gas economy in particular regions of the country. But again, there's I think a real danger in being able to say things that sound so good when they are not rooted in the reality of the crisis that we face, where they don't line up with, when Canada talks about our Paris commitment is incompatible with 1.5 degrees. And yet it sounds like we're talking about the same thing. That said, I did want to end, as I mentioned, on a highlight. I had the privilege in 2017 of going on a United Church of Canada badge to COP23 that was hosted by the government of Fiji in Bonn, Germany. And at that time, though, I was a delegation of one. And one of the things, and I think really the highlight for me already just a few days into it, is being part of this community of people of faith from across Canada. We all come with different experiences and knowledge, and I think each our own wisdom, and to be able to be processing some of what's happening, in community like this, I think is really, really important. And I know for me, it's been really uplifting. And I think the other piece with that is I'm already getting quite excited about the ways in which we might, even in these 2 weeks, continue to sort out how to engage with government leaders, but also anticipating some of the advocacy and action going forward. We haven't yet seen a lot from our new environment and climate change minister in Scotland, though I know that he was part of an announcement related to coal phase out this morning that I haven't had a chance to go back and see yet. But I am going to hold on to some hopefulness there that he is someone that we can engage with, and that we can start to put some real action behind the words and the commitments that our government representatives have made. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie and Janet and Tony. I see people are eager to ask some questions, so maybe we'll move to that and see if any of the delegates have responses to, and I'll invite others to add questions, or if you'd like to just raise your hand, you're welcome to ask the question yourself. So Jim Hodgson asks, is there any reaction to the news that Indigenous peoples will get 1.7 billion in recognition of role in protecting forests? And the second question is around knowing we need to make changes in our economy and that our current mode of extractive capitalism represents a threat. How do we do to Indigenous rights? How do we do this in the context of Western alienation and different concerns around climate change, the urgency of it, and also recognizing the regional challenges? And I open the floor to any of you who'd like to respond to one or both of those questions. Any thoughts?
I might
It's a
speak
question.
to,
Yeah, I'll just
ahead, Janet.
say that I was listening to the session where the 1.7 billion, or in one of the sessions where 1.7 billion for Indigenous peoples was mentioned, and it was a head of a bank and others there, and they had there was a couple of Indigenous people there, one from Peru, and she was, there wasn't, they had specific projects that they were referring to there, but they didn't actually say where the money was going to go or how it was going to be distributed. And I guess from some of the things that I've heard from other people and the Indigenous people on some of the other things I've been watching from the Amazon, we have to really question and wonder where that money is going to go and how it's going to get distributed, because it could be a way of making it look like a really good partnership if you're just reading about it, but in fact it might be devastation. So Tony might have more on that one, but that's all I'm going to say.
Yeah, just in terms of the involvement, I think that throwing money at a problem and then not working through what systemically is happening with the curtail of rights and the destruction of particular environments and areas, there's sort of no plan at it. So when you're looking at how they're working with particular groups, so the Shuar people and Ecuador and others that are helping to promote particular type programs. And so this is fine. This is something that we can do. It does lend to sort of the scientism of saying that we must work through in this priority to build the capacity and build an understanding of what it's going to take to kind of work together and kind of build in this model into what we're already doing. But we're not going to in any way curtail what we're doing. We're not going to in any way fix the relationships that are toxic in these areas and that are likely going to be more of a hindrance in the long run. So we have there's a big promotion of Pope Francis's Laudato Si and the efforts of the community of faith to respond to some of the environmental concerns in Laudato Si and in the beloved Amazonia documents. What it's talking about is support of Indigenous people, but it's not going in any way toward at the structures that are hindering Indigenous people. It's not putting its own neck on the line in terms of the Catholic Church and the people there in order to facilitate or mediate the relationship and build a better model that we can work from. It is merely saying they have a point, and let's recognize that, and maybe we can lift that up and kind of do something and advocate for that point. But it's not in any way really ingraining change into what we're doing. It's kind of bringing us to the point of, just as Canada is doing, bringing us to the point of a good idea and then kind of hoping that it'll work out. What we saw with, and I take it back to Truth and Reconciliation Day. This has been on the books and kind of worked through once we had the 215 children in the mass grave at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. The government immediately after the next week sort of threw on the books the Reconciliation Day on September 30th and said, this is going to be our Reconciliation Day. And with no input or with no working with Indigenous communities, half the country took the day off, half the country didn't recognize it. We kind of just shirked it aside and it was a holiday. And so what does that do for the cause or the interests if we're not working through this with Indigenous people to try to build a better model for the future? So that's kind of how I'm looking at this 1.7 billion, because a lot of times this will go to government interests, this will go to corporate interests, this will go to those things that are approved that funding can go through, rather than to the grassroots people, rather than to effect change that is being advocated for from these areas that are not being listened to right now.
If I can pick up a little bit on what Tony's just said, I think so much, and this also speaks to the question about sort of how do we deal with the urgency and Western alienation at the same time. And again, as on the question on Indigenous rights, Tony might, as someone located in Alberta, might be better positioned to speak to that. But I'll give it a go and then maybe pass it back over. I think so much of this is about relationship. I think that when we look at how do we have those conversations, how do we move things forward? I mean, on the one hand, there's a part of me that is very impatient and then wants us to just move forward. And when you look at the realities of the warming world, to say, well, we don't like it. Well, I don't like it either. But that doesn't change the fact that climate change is here and it's accelerating and it's starting to have impacts on all of us. But I think that it's having those conversations about, well, how can we do different? How can we, I mean, part of the frustration I have with the government of Alberta is there's a lack of willingness to engage in the questions about transition. Canada and the world will transition one way or another. We can plan for it and put measures in place to make sure that people are protected, that people have income supports if they are if they're at risk of losing a job, that they can have retraining if they are interested in working in a new area. Or we can just pretend like it's not happening and watch everything fall off the edge of a cliff, which, yeah, is not perhaps the imagery I wanted to sort of conjure up. But it's one of those things where, but if we have those conversations and we can start to continue to build relationship, I think it's obviously it's fundamental to the work of reconciliation. I also think it's fundamental to the work of addressing climate change is to talk about it. And one of the things, I'll give a little shameless plug here, one of the things that the local engagement group at For the Love of Creation has done is to put together a series of conversation guides. The first one is really just starting at zero. If you've never had a conversation, if you don't know how to talk about climate change, This is a guide that can help enable that. It also situates it in our faith, which allows us to find hopefully some common ground where there are certain things that we have in common. Because at the end of the day, I think that we share, regardless of what we think about what should be done or shouldn't be done, we have a lot of hopes and fears in common. And if we can look at what we're trying to achieve collectively, then it might help to diffuse, to depolarize some of the issues that we're working on. Thank you.
Can I say something about that? About advocacy and urgency?
Sure.
It's something that I struggle to figure out all the time. And I think it's been that much harder over the past year and a half of COVID, when we haven't been able to gather than ever before. But we also, the kinds of alienation that's happening and isolation all over the world, probably especially in North America, though, not just from this past year and a half, but this idea that we're finding people of like mind and just find ourselves in these little rabbit holes all by ourselves with people that think like us. And it's really challenging to figure out how to then find people that don't think like you, or mix it up, and then given that we haven't even been I'm a very community-minded person, but I haven't been getting together with people except online. And then I'm really down rabbit holes with people that think like me. And that's been good. It's been, I've been grateful for that ability to connect with people all over the world, but it doesn't get me talking to the people that don't think like me. And, but I want to say that my personal experience in my church community for years, I've been advocating for financial, what do you call it?
Divestment?
Divestment, I'm tired now. It's the end of my day. Divestment, and from various things. And oh my gosh, it has been so difficult to have that conversation. Like, people just would not have it and with the United Church of Canada, I've been involved in mining justice, and we've tried to get Goldcorp off the pension funds, and all of these kinds of conversations are very tricky to have with people who, I've been to Guatemala a couple of times. I have a number of people that I have in communities where I've experienced firsthand what their lives are like. And so I understand the urgency and for that kind of conversation to have. And I think the stories that we can share about how we feel about climate and how we feel affected, how we feel frightened for our children and for our grandchildren and for the trees and the animals around us. I think those are important openings to having a bigger conversation about really big things. We don't know where it's going to go, but hopefully we can find whatever ways we can. I think it's our responsibility to find those ways to have those conversations, because after years of me raising that at my church board and them never doing anything about it, I heard it mentioned in a meeting the other day. And they're talking about how maybe they should, look at sort of where, this is and that is. And I went, wow, that's amazing. That's great. I have to take that as a really big move forward, just like it is to have the banks at COP, even if I think it's all too late and too little and not enough. And
Thank you, Janet and Carrie and Tony. I'm just looking through. Chris, you had your hand up. Did you want to say something, or did you feel it if you already, has that been addressed?
No, I think everyone responded to my question with a lot of thought, and I really appreciate people's perspectives. I guess to clarify, and maybe I should have put it this way, I think that Carrie touched it a little bit on it at the end. I just wonder if the future of advocacy in Western Canada is about promoting that transition, about retraining, about dismantling things like Bill 1. I think that for for allies, for people that are interested in climate justice in Alberta, where Tony and I are, there might be a little bit of a concern about whether the transition discussions are going to be happening in Eastern Canada and not in Western Canada. So I just wonder if the future of advocacy is actually doing more about promoting the transition when we have provincial governments that are not interested in engaging at all. But I think that you've answered that beautifully. So thank you.
I'd like to mention too that Marty Tyndall is here as well, has been to COP several times as well, and has highlighted that the Faithful Footprints program is one specific program we have for properties to be able to reduce their footprint. Marty, did you want to add anything else? Yeah. Having been to COP yourself and hearing the reflections from our current delegates?
Well, it's wonderful to hear the reflections from delegates. I'm so grateful for your deep engagement in this. It matters so much. I've just noticed the comments. Yes, at least since the 40th General Council in 2009, the United Church of Canada, I can say, has named climate change as representing the greatest moral and spiritual challenge of our time. And I think on the ground and throughout the councils of our church, we have been using those words. And they're important words. I cannot tell you how many climate scientists have said to me over the years that we need you. We need church and other faith leaders speaking about this, because climate scientists are reluctant to bring a moral message. They believe that's our job. I believe it is our job. And so I think raising this is very important in the conversation. I think what has already been said is so important. Carrie, you spoke about the importance of relationships. I agree. I'm particularly interested in how the churches can move forward in relationships with governments, in supporting them and keeping the commitments they're making at COP26. And because it's not only the federal government, right? There are other governmental bodies there, and pushing them to go deeper. Minister Catherine McKenna, when she was Minister of the Environment, expected churches to do more. She just thought we'd be showing up more. We were in the United Church able to point to Faithful Footprints, which is, to get back to that, Lori, our commitment, our program. It's managed by Faith in the Common Good, but it's the United Church's program by which we committed back in 2016 to reduce our own organizational carbon footprint by 80% by 2050. I think all of those involved know it has to be better than that now. But the church provides grant support to congregations who are prepared to deal with our buildings. Our leaky buildings account for almost 40% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. So, and we're big property owners. So this is significant in the big picture. You probably regret now having invited me to speak. I'm passionate about this. I'm very grateful for everyone's efforts here. There's more I could say, but this matters so much. Thank you all.
Well, thank you, Marty. I very much appreciate your leadership and initiative as moderator. And I have to say that I wasn't with this position in my role as the United Church at the time, but it was one of a forum that you convened that I was first connected with some ecumenical efforts around climate. So I think it's a leadership and among the ecumenical community across Canada that we are where we are now because of the work of many people, including yourselves. So thank you. Okay, so we'll just take a few more moments if there's any other questions folks have, and then we'll give a chance for our delegates to have a final thought and closing prayer. So I see some messages. Oh, sorry. Janet?
Sarah Arthurs has her hand up.
I'll turn on my video. Yeah, I put my couple of questions in the chat, so I'll read them because I kind of thought them through and the words came. So So this was to the candidates, and I just also need to say that it is very inspiring for me to hear each of you speak, and so I'm really grateful for that. And my mind is already going to how we can leverage your experiences with COP26 and get out to the network of Green Exodus, which is the work that I'm doing. But my question is, given your immersion and heightened awareness of the ecological crisis that we are all in, whether we know it or not, in the best of all possible worlds, how would quote unquote church be happening differently? At the systems level, the national level, the regions, and the particular of the John Doe United Church. What is the focus? How are we leveraging our assets, funds from churches closing across Canada? And what is our pastoral role in the midst of fires, floods, climate, anxiety, and resilience? And then an add-on to that is Bill Phipps, who was part of Earth Jam 21, which happened in September this year, states that our ecological crisis is a spiritual crisis. What actions can we take as holders of spiritual wisdom within our culture, however we've messed that up and however we do it well? How can we enable all of us to step into this as a spiritual crisis, both Christian and spiritual, but not religious, and no faith circles? So that's probably way too much stuff, but pick whatever is calling your name, and I'd love to hear your reflections. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
And perhaps I would just suggest that each of you pick up the spiritual piece, because that's how we were going to wrap up and close. So you can answer Sarah's thoughts, and then also the piece around how we as people of faith, or as we move forward, what should we keep in mind? And I'll remind folks that I put in the chat some links to the delegates' reflections and how to stay in touch. And then if you'd like to include your email in the messaging, then we'll be able to send you a Concern for Climate Justice update when we have the delegate and FLC are involved in coming up with next advocacy steps. So thank you. And I'll let you answer the questions that Sarah has posed. So.
Maybe I'll jump in, and I feel somehow ill-equipped, though also very encouraged by the tremendous feedback that that Sarah and others have given us. So thank you for that. To my mind, a lot of it comes precisely to sort of what we landed on as the name for this ecumenical initiative, For the Love of Creation. One of the things, and my apologies to Lori and a couple of others who've probably heard this too much in the last little while. A year and a half, my family and I moved from almost downtown Ottawa to a farm in West Quebec. And it means that every day I'm outside, I'm with the animals, I'm looking after things, I can see the stars in the night sky. And it's helped me regain a rootedness that I think I'd lost living in the city for a long time. And it's not to say that the solution to this is, to leave the city and move to a farm, because I know that there are issues with agriculture as well. But what it has shown me really is the value of connectedness with the created world. And that, I've struggled more this week spending time. I realized this morning that part of my mistake was I kept going to the plenaries with government leaders who were spouting off all kinds of wonderful promises. But that when I connect with sort of grassroots action, and when I connect with the plants and the animals right outside, that it helps me to
Love it. So perfect.
we don't ever need a doorbell, because the connectedness and the rootedness and the beginning with love, I think, is what has really struck me as fundamental to a response as people of faith, that we remember that God created the world, that God loves the world, that God loves us, and that we are invited to love God And I think part of that for me is our care for the earth.
I'm going to jump in and say that I too live on a small farm, and the walks I take each day in the forests, and I live down the road from the giant old growth that I'm so concerned about and are being cut down, even though there are great global plans for deforestation. 1,000-year-old trees are coming down. And it's those kinds of relationships that I have with things like the big leaf maple and the fir trees around me that have, and the water that sort of originally got me sort of really involved in a lot of things, realizing how important they are to my survival, to your survival, and to all of our survival. And I think people have to, I just led five-week braiding sweetgrass book clubs over this past year and a half with people all across Canada and regionally and locally, and a lot of them from the church. And people are so moved by that. You know, people are crying for relationship with the bigger world outside of our church buildings. And I think when we can bring that into our churches and when we can go out into those relationships, we just make all of our relationships much richer.
I'll just add a response here. When that question, or that first part of Sarah's question, talks about how do we do church differently. And so Sarah has been deeply involved with looking at how gathering and community building looks for different communities and different mindsets. And I think that that's been a very productive, and I've been involved with a lot of what she's been putting forward and in support of that. I think that when we start thinking about the model that we live in, the model of church, that is an unsustainable model. That is a model that does not reflect the spiritual leanings that we're trying to abide by now as a world is changing, a more diverse world, a world that will, for the United Church, be one of look through an anti-racist lens, and in a way that is helping to build different ways of community, and sort of the rebounding of sense of self being tied to the wellness of others. And so when we talk about how we move forward in this model of church that is not church, church that is not a conventional way of thinking, where church is community, church is relationship, church is the resiliency of working with one another and to help one another. That model is very helpful to the work we're doing at COP, to the work that we're doing in community, but it involves our action. And I think that for a long time, we've taken a long time to learn, taken a long time to listen and to take on particular issues, perhaps with varying levels of success, with the intercultural church and other things for the United Church, but also for other churches that are working on diversity and reconciliation issues. So there are ways in which we are stepping into or stepping back into community, for being the heart of that community, being the place of safety, the place of wholeness that we can hold for the community. And that this is an ideal that we continue to work through in our theology, in the faith-based progress that we're using, but it translates well into those from other faiths and those from no faith. And so I think that there is a way in which we need to continue that walk and continue that exploration by doing and learning We can't, a lot of people don't want to do things the wrong way. I mean, you have to do something in order to learn. Otherwise, we're just stuck in a mode of consuming information. And I think we've done that for a long time. We need to start living into some of the things that we've learned and expressing that in ways that help and support the issues that are dear to us. I know that I was always surprised during the presidential election in 2016 when people would not speak out to support Hillary, wouldn't put her placards on the lawn. And that was because they were afraid of being attacked for that. They didn't want to publicly express their own opinion or what they thought. And so this is a very great hindrance to being able to live out that promise of diversity and life and acceptance and the willingness to be wrong or the willingness to be different or the willingness to be looking for ways of connection. And I think that the more that we can work in that mode of building relationship, doing things, small things that will help us in our anxiety to balance our interests with what we see in the world around us. So as we come out into the end of this first week of COP, November 6th is the day of action. So I'm trying to encourage people to take some small action, do something, light a candle, think about these issues, have a prayer, talk to one another, and give some hope and consideration for the difference that we live in and that we need to lift up as we seek solutions, as we seek to build a better life, not just for ourselves, but for others and our descendants. Thanks.
Thank you, Tony and Carrie and Janet. I know I speak for all of us and for the church for your service and leadership in this. It's really been a great session, but it's just a piece of the commitment that you've made over the many years in many ways to love all of creation and to defend and witness and proclaim where we need to go as a church and as a world. So thank you so much and for this gathering, and thank you to all of those who've been able to attend. There are links in the chat on how you can stay connected, and I'll ask now Janet to lead us in a closing prayer.
I have a candle lit to remind us of our relationship with Jesus, the light of the world for those of us that follow in his teachings and believe that he walked in right relationship with the earth that he lived. Dear Creator, we all have grief on our hearts for the state of this world. We know that even when we are with others who don't express that grief, that they too must understand and hold a grief and pain in their hearts for the state of this world and for all of creation. I am grateful for Tony's opening today with us as we gathered, for he helped us begin in a good way, paying attention to the moment and to why we gathered and how we must remember to walk ourselves. And I'm grateful for each of you that took the time to be involved and to listen to our experiences as we have gathered through the night hours to listen to people, world leaders and Indigenous leaders and youth leaders, politicians and negotiators, as they share words about how they too are going to respond to the climate crisis that we're in. And I pray that their words come from their hearts, and that even if they don't come from their hearts now, that as they speak those words over and over again, that they speak, that it will sink, those words will sink into their hearts, and that they too understand the urgency of our relationships with this world that sustains us and that we cannot live without. As we discern our parts, each of us as we leave today, our parts in relationship to creation and what we might do to walk forward in a better way or to take some kind of action. May we all go in the light of Jesus, in the light of the Creator that inspires and guides us. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks, Lori.
Thank you, Janet.
Thanks, Tony and Carrie, and all of you.
Feel free to unmic and say goodbye if you want to just sign out that way. It's nice to hear folks.
Bye for now.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to see Janet and Tony again. This is Tammy. See you later. Thanks for all your good work, all of you.